Hello, hello, welcome back to Loki's Librarian. If you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina, and I do a book review a week, mixing up a cocktail while I review it. It's called Books and Booze. Tomorrow I start my last class for SDI's gunsmithing class. I'm going to be building a 1911, so that informed this week's book, which is The Guns of John Moses Browning, the remarkable story of the inventor whose firearms changed the world, by Nathan Gorenstein. The accompanying cocktail is called Gunsmoke. It is 1.5 ounces of bourbon, a quarter ounce of Amaro, a bar spoon of Mezcal, 3/4 ounce lemon juice, a half ounce of grapefruit juice, half ounce of cinnamon syrup, and grapefruit twist to garnish. I don't have cinnamon syrup. I'm going to use simple syrup and throw a cinnamon stick into the cocktail when I'm mixing it. Probably won't be the same effect, but that's the best I could do. I wasn't going to buy a $20 bottle of syrup, and I wasn't going to make my own and have it just sit there and go bad in 2 weeks. So let's do this. John Moses Browning was born January 23rd, 1885 in Ogden, Utah. This was still a territory at the time. It wouldn't become a state for another 40 years. I'm not sure when Utah became a state. I feel like it was the 1870s, maybe 20 years. No, it can't have been. It had to have been like the 1880s, 1890s. I'll explain how I know that in a little bit. Anyways, he was born in Ogden, Utah territory of the United States, to Jonathan Browning and Jonathan Browning's second wife, Elizabeth Clark. Now, this is partly why I know that it was still a territory and definitely not a state. If you have even a vague knowledge of U.S. history, then 1855 in Utah probably tells you the family was Mormon, and indeed they were. Jonathan Browning having been an early convert to the faith. I think he was one of the original converts. I think he learned it directly from Joseph Smith and Brigham Young? Yeah, Brigham Young. That was the number 2 guy. What should I say? 1.5 ounces. The family was Mormon, and John Moses certainly grew up Mormon along with his brothers. When Jonathan Browning, so Browning Sr., converted in Illinois, he was married to his first wife, also an Elizabeth. I'm going to call her Elizabeth I. And the whole Browning clan converted and moved to Utah. Now, once there, Browning Sr. took on 2 additional wives, plural marriage being allowable under early Mormon doctrine. So his first wife was not thrilled with this, but Mormon doctrine only required tacit approval from the first wife, meaning that she didn't have to necessarily approve it. She had to acknowledge it and not say anything against it, which we don't obviously know what was said. None of this was recorded. We do know that Elizabeth I was not thrilled with her husband taking on another wife, so she may have said something simple like, "not in my house," which Browning Sr. took to mean, okay, but your next family can't live with me. They have to live somewhere else, which is what he did. Both his second and third wives and the children from those marriages all grew up more or less in the same household. They were one big family, and I believe there was John Moses and Matt were both born of the second Elizabeth, and the third brother who partook of the Browning fortunes, if you will, was Ed. It may have been Jonathan Ed, and they went by Ed, who was of the third marriage. And they all, again, grew up fairly close together. Now, John Browning, growing up in Ogden, which was still very much the wild, wild west at this point in time, designed his first shotgun when he was 10 years old. 1/4 ounce of Amaro. I should have gotten the Amaro Nonino, but I'm going with the Torani. They're more or less the same thing. Oh no, 1/4 ounce. I have to really eyeball this one. So it was the wild, wild west. He was 10 years old. And the shotgun he designed was basically just soldered together with wire, and it was the wire and the barrel and a stock, and it was a 2-man operation. So basically he aimed while his younger brother poured the powder and lit it off, and their goal was to kill a couple of birds for dinner, which they succeeded because they had like 3 birds that were really close together. One of them I think was killed outright, and the other 2 were wounded enough they were able to catch them and dispatch them, and then they had dinner. And that was a big deal. He provided a meal for the family that way. And when he brought this, shotgun that he designed to Browning Sr., Browning Sr. was like not impressed because it was a pretty dangerous operation. In fact, he was able to basically just step on it and break it. It's basically just a splash. I don't know if I did that right. We're going to say that's good. Just a little bit of mezcal. Anyways, so Browning Sr. broke it and essentially apprenticed his son at that point to himself. So he grew up working in his father's workshop and learning all about gunsmithing. And that was the early start for his future. And he spent the next decade building everything from like bow and arrow sets that he would sell to the neighborhood kids in exchange for chores or small stipends, to learning how to make moccasins from a Native American who came by annually to make shoes for the Mormons. And he was just a sponge, soaking everything up. He learned from his father. He learned from everybody around him. He learned to make things. He was a builder with his hands. Like, that was what he did. He was very tacit. But he was also able to think three-dimensionally, which he explains in the book. And it's something that used to be fairly common. It became uncommon with the advent of computers and CAD programming because you no longer had to think three-dimensionally. You could have the computer do it for you. Eventually, as he's growing up with his father, he's said something about wanting to invent things or make a better firearm. Browning Sr. said something like, "I'd like to see that," and not sarcastically, not like a "yeah, right, kid, sure," but as in, really, son, I would like to see you make something of yourself. And with that challenge, he kind of did. I went with fresh lemons today. I was feeling fresh and zesty, so we're going with a fresh lemon. A quarter ounce. So give me a minute here to squish a lemon or two. It's going to be a lot easier to get a half ounce out of the grapefruit, let me just tell you. Him and his brother Matthew, and again, half brother from third wife Ann Emmett, all part of the same family, and they all eventually became the family business. Now, part of his launch into manhood, John Moses and brother Matthew purchased his father's shop from him and set about inventing firearms. Now, John Moses kind of came by all of... Well, I guess I am having grapefruit for lunch because I only need like a half ounce from this. Oh my god. I have this little blue tray that I make it on, and I'm very glad because my computer desk is now completely soaked with citrus juice. So they bought their father's workshop from him. All right, Browning Sr. was ready to retire, and he was kind of an inventor in his own right. He had invented a harmonica gun, which is a very odd-looking device. I don't know if we have any pictures of his, but I found a couple of pictures online of what harmonica guns look like, and they are very odd-looking. But Browning Sr. had invented one of those, and John Moses created his first rifle in 1878, which Browning Sr. lived to see before dying on June 21st, 1879. Now, at this point in the family history, the children of Elizabeth I fucked up. Let me just put it that way. So Browning Sr. died intestate. He had no will when he passed. So the estate was put into probate. All right, and he had land. He had some bricks from a brick manufactory that he had tried to get done, but he also had debt. He had about $5,000 worth of debt. So the probate court said this needs to be, we have to sell some things off to pay his debts and put one of the sons of Elizabeth I and the husband of one of the daughters from the first marriage in charge of the probates, or in charge of the auction for sale. And they came in and said that that several very key items that are needed to run a gun manufacturer, namely the foot power lathe, anvil, and bellows, were not included in the sales contract that John Moses had made with his father. Stir that up, and then I'm going to mix it. There we go. So John Moses had to buy all that back again from auction, even though he maintained it as part of the original sales price. And given the wild success that's about to follow, I can't help but think that the children from the first marriage were like, maybe we shouldn't have been such rabid dickheads about this. Water under the bridge, because he did manage to buy those things at auction and went on to become a very, very famous gun designer. Let me shake this up. I really hope I got enough cinnamon in there. It's not terrible. Supposed to garnish with a grapefruit twist. Because of the lack of cinnamon, I'm going to garnish with a cinnamon stick. Just because. Browning Sr. also lived long enough to see John Moses married to Rachel Teresa Child, who, unlike Browning Sr.'s first wife, expressed a very clear opinion on plural marriage. When John Moses brought up the possibility of a second marriage, Rachel said, quote, "over your dead body." Well, that's quite tasty. There was clearly no misinterpreting that. There was no tacit understanding or permission. She said quite clearly, "No, you will not be taking a second wife. I will be the only wife of John Moses Browning," and ultimately became a moot point because the state, or the Utah Territory, became a state, and part of joining the United States was that they had to rewrite their doctrine to no longer allow for plural marriage. So, actually ended up working in his favor because he didn't have to, get rid of a wife. So that was a good thing. Anyways, with that, no misinterpretation, they married and had 10 children together. Now, part of what brought John Moses to my attention was something that I did not know, that his designs had been manufactured by Winchester. Obviously, I recognized the name, John Browning, Browning Firearms, very famous even to this day. I didn't know that he got his start when he was recognized by Winchester, and Winchester manufactured some of his early works. And that all came to my attention when I read Captive of the Labyrinth last October. So how he came to the attention of Winchester Arms is that a salesman for Winchester was in Ogden and stopped by the Browning Brothers store, where they sold, among other things, of course, rifles that Browning had designed and manufactured. Now, at a very small scale, they were all hand machined because it was a small family business, John Moses invented them, brothers Matt and Ed did the machining, everything got made, but because it was a 3-man operation, they didn't have the factory equipment that the Winchester Arms Repeating Arms Company had. They had very limited runs of 25, 30 rifles. And this salesman recognized that it was an outstanding piece of equipment and went ahead and bought one of them. He also recognized that the Browning brothers were selling these little reloading, all-in-one reloaders. It would decap, resize the cartridges. You could reprime, repowder everything. All of which the design of this little device was patented, and the patent was owned by Winchester. Now, Winchester was notoriously vehement in protecting their patent designs. That rifle that he had designed was kind of his ace in the hole, and he didn't even know he had it or needed it. Rather than just unleashing the Winchester legal machine on Browning for their illicit manufacture of this Winchester product, the salesman brought one of those rifles back with him to Winchester President Thomas Bennett. And Winchester tried very hard to replicate the Browning single-shot rifle without violating Browning's patent, and they couldn't do it. And they knew that it would be a massive seller because it was a very well-designed firearm. So I don't remember if Bennett made the trip to Ogden or if they invited Browning to New Haven. Either way, a meeting between them happened, and Winchester purchased the patent from Browning for $50,000. It was an absurd sum of money for 1878, and it definitely made them overnight millionaires. The Browning brothers, all of them, not just John Moses, but also Matt and Ed. And then rather than burning what looked to be a very lucrative bridge, Winchester settled Browning's own patent violation on the reloading device for the bargain basement sum of $1, which was smart on the part of Winchester. And this began a almost 2-decade-long solid working relationship between Winchester and Browning. Winchester would purchase their patents and then not even make some of them because they already had a similar product in their line, but they also knew that if they didn't purchase the patent, somebody else would, and then there would be competition. And this worked for a bit, but since Browning was never an employee of Winchester, as he built a name for himself, he was able to branch out from rifles into shotguns, machine guns, pistols. He designed everything from lever action to pump action, automatic, semi-automatic, gas-operated blowback action. He just kept going and going and going. And a lot of what made that possible were advances in ammunition. We went from the black powder ammunition to the powderless. There is still powder involved, but it's not black powder, which burns very dirty. The powderless allowed for gas operated, and there's a whole lot more that goes into that. If you want to know more about it, read the book. He actually does go into a fair descriptions of all of these processes. Now, when John Moses starts dipping his toes into fully automatic, he's trying to come up with something that was more user-friendly than the Gatling gun, which worked okay during the Civil War, but was ungainly, it was heavy, it was prone to jamming. He developed the first belt-fed, fully automatic, gas-operated machine gun, and gas isn't pouring gasoline. The gas is that blowback action from the ammunition. And since it was clearly not a hunting machine, Browning took the design to Colt, which had the contract to supply the U.S. Army with firearms, and Browning demonstrated just the superb craftsmanship. He fired like 1,800 rounds with the only... Stop, my puppies are dreaming back there. How you doing, Freya? Freya, you dreaming? The only stops in action were to change the belts, and it never jammed once. The barrel got red hot, it never failed, and it was an impressive display. All right, the military was duly impressed with this, and this is well before World War I happened. It may even have been before the Spanish-American War, although there would not have been time to manufacture these for the Spanish-American War. In addition to all of this, he had begun work on the first pump-action shotgun, the model 1893. Now, most people aren't familiar with that model because while Winchester manufactured it, the gun was buggy. And it happens, right? There were flaws with the design. And one customer report, he shipped the gun back to the Winchester manufactory with a letter that said, quote, he was out hunting and while shooting, the bolt blew back into his eye. Yeah, piece of the gun flew off into his eye. And he would not shoot the gun anymore and would make a present of it. Now, Winchester confirmed that he was using the appropriate ammunition. That is a big deal because if you're using the wrong ammunition, the gun could blow up because you're using overpressure. Basically, if you're using the wrong type of ammunition, you can create overpressure and the gun will just explode in your face. Didn't happen here. The guy did everything right. He was not a novice, target shooter. It just, the gun was buggy. So Winchester basically issued a general recall, and it was so thoroughly done that there are not a lot of 1893 shotguns left, and those that are probably in private collections and are never fired for very clear safety reasons. The shotgun Winchester replaced the recall with was the 1897, which was such a superior shotgun. The military used them extensively during trench warfare in 1917, where it became known as the trench sweeper. For more details on that, I would actually refer you to the Fat Electrician, who did a video on the Winchester 1897 and why Germany, the country that introduced the world to mustard gas, petitioned to have the use of the 1897 declared as a war crime. It has to do with the ability to slam fire. Basically, there's no trigger disconnect, so all you have to do is hold the trigger down and continue to pump the shotgun action, and it's going to immediately fire. That's called a slam fire, and it creates an impressive amount of damage when you basically are firing down the funnel that is a trench. Now, while Winchester produced the first pump-action shotgun off Browning's design in 1893, the 1893 itself was a pivotal year for Browning for a completely different reason. February 15th, 1893, he signed a patent over to Colt in return for a royalty payment on each gun sold, and this was the first type of this contract for Browning. Previously, he had just sold the patent outright and then walked away with cash in hand, basically. But now, he's getting a return on his investment. Every time they sell one of those, he's getting, $1 or however much the royalty payment was. Sorry, another typo. Now, when he later attempted to change that dynamic with Winchester in, I think, 1899, pointing out this royalty contract with Colt, Bennett refused, and the long working relationship between Winchester and Browning ended. In 1895, he invented the first slide-action pistol, which is technically called a short recoil semi-automatic pistol. This has become basically the standard in semi-automatic pistols, and the author says, quote, Browning's design outlasted all its competitors to become the fundamental mechanism of virtually all modern handguns. Any movie, any TV show you see, any video game you see where somebody grabs the top of the gun and pulls it back and then releases it to slide forward ready to fire, that's all due to John Moses Browning. Right? Nobody had done that before. He invented that. And in March of 1897, Browning made his first trip to Liège, Belgium, I'm probably mispronouncing that, where the Fabrique Nationale d'Armes de Guerre, which basically just means the, arms of war factory, was located. And he did this as a result of a friendship formed several years prior with Hart Berg, who at the time of his first trip to Belgium was working as a general sales agent and international representative for the factory, and he invited Browning over to show Fabrique Nationale what he could do. And while there, Browning demonstrated a prototype that filed. Oh my god, another typo. I post the written reviews on my website, Loki's Librarian, but I go off script quite a bit during the videos, so I have to like fix like obvious typos immediately because I'll never catch them when I go back later. I just like copy and paste it. So that's why I have to fix the typos now. So anyways, while there, Browning demonstrated a prototype that fired 500 shots in a row without jam or failure. And FN was impressed and made an immediate offer. $2,000 up front for the royalty with 2 gold francs per pistol sold. And by 1904, 100,000 pistols had been sold. By 1909, that number was 500,000. By 1914, it was 750,000. In addition to the royalties, the pistol was the first to carry his name, the Pistolet Browning, because everything manufactured in America carried the name of the manufacturer, Winchester Colt. So ubiquitous and famous was that slide action that soon any slide action pistol was called the Browning, even if it wasn't actually created by Browning. It was wildly popular new tech and sold like crazy in Europe. And following the boom of gun purchases, there was a ton of news stories about accidental discharges leading to accidental death. That is not a problem of the gun. The gun was actually designed quite well. It worked brilliantly. There were no problems there. The reason for all of this was because even 100 years ago, Europeans couldn't handle firearms. Browning actually did take this into consideration, and he started designing double safety features, one operated by the thumb, one on the grip. And it's right here. The only way to activate that safety is to have a firm grip on the grip. Repetition. Yeah, it's literally called the grips. You have to have a firm handle on it or it's not going to shoot. Browning's success did breed lawsuits, but not for the accidental death, because while the Europeans didn't know how to handle firearms, they also knew that if you're going to be stupid, you're going to have to pay the consequence yourself. And they had the very adult and bizarre belief that you were responsible for your own actions, even the accidental ones. And while the failure of the Winchester 1893 shotgun certainly could have brought legitimate lawsuits, and there was talk of it, Winchester's customer service team was so fast on that, like just so fast to correct that error, and recalling them, issuing these new shotguns, new and improved, better shotguns, that no lawsuit ever materialized. Now, the lawsuit that Browning faced was a patent infringement lawsuit filed by Georg Luger. Now, Luger is probably also a name that is recognized, as his parabellum pistol, aka the Luger, which used a toggle linkage for firing, was also wildly popular and was a popular wartime souvenir for returning doughboys from the trenches. Now, the lawsuit in question had to do with that toggle linkage, which in itself could not really be patented. The toggle linkage was something that was used outside of the firearms industry. It actually made its leap to the firearms industry in 1893 when Hugo Borchardt designed it. Now, Hugo Borchardt's pistol was way too big. It was 14 inches long, which is like that. It's freaking crazy. And it was just ungainly and didn't work overly well. Luger, over in Europe, was actually put in charge of redesigning the Borchardt to make it usable and easier to carry. Independently of this, Browning had been working on toggle bolt linkage all of his own, which in the contract for manufacture with Winchester was acknowledged to be similar to the Borchardt design. However, because that toggle linkage was used in different industries like the Singer sewing machines, and in fact it was because Borchardt had worked for Singer that he got the idea to use this toggle linkage in firearms, that was not really a problem. All right, the problem was making the rest of the design around it stand out enough that it would not be an infringement on Borchardt's design. And Browning did it. He made his independent enough that that was not a problem. And he filed his patent with the U.S. Patent Office in 1899. A year later, Luger filed for patent infringement with the U.S. Patent Office, basically claiming that Browning had stolen the design from him when he was on a return ship from Belgium to America with one of Borchardt's, or not Borchardt's, Luger's friends, who was on the boat. But Browning basically said, I didn't even talk to the man. I didn't know he was even on the boat. Now, unfortunately for Luger, Browning had sketches of his idea going back to 1894 and a working prototype as of 1897. So Luger's story fell apart, and he initially tried to back out of the lawsuit. However, Browning felt that his integrity had been impugned, and so he demanded satisfaction in court, and the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office said, yes, you're right, let's get to the bottom of this. And he won quite handily because he had those sketches from 1894 and the working prototype from 1897. And for his part, as revenge, he did everything he could to ensure the parabellum would not be manufactured in the United States. And since we have already established that the Europeans didn't know how to shoot, That was bad news for Luger. Now, between the lawsuit with Luger and the advent of World War I, Browning would create what is arguably the most famous handgun of all time, the Colt Model 1911. And the reason for its invention is that the military was looking for an upgrade in their sidearms. And after some very not scientific testing, namely they had a couple of officers, Major Louis Lagarde and Captain John Thompson, go out and fire multiple rounds of different calibers at cadavers and cows to determine which would be the most effective. It was determined that the sidearm should be .45 caliber. And what's interesting about this is that the military's testers, Lagarde and Thompson, while deciding on the .45, also stated absolutely explicitly that the only truly effective handgun bullet is the one that hits a vital spot, which means it doesn't matter what the caliber is. If you hit something important, you're going to cause the person you're shooting at to lose blood pressure, and then you will win your gunfight. Basically, that's all it takes, despite the reality that that's all you need to do is make somebody lose blood pressure. There are still internet warriors who will insist that if you shouldn't even bother with a .22 because it's just a weak caliber bullet. Although, let me just say, even if you get some shot someplace not vital with a .22, you're unlikely to just bounce back and walk away. It's still a major trauma. You're still going to need surgery. Now, with the advent of World War I, Browning was called in to create a fully automatic machine gun. His initial one that had been tested for the military with Colt was still a little bit buggy. There were other manufacturers who were given the opportunity to get the government contract, but the results ultimately were not even close. Browning took the design advice from the military and from Colt and created a fully automatic, I think this one was belt-fed too. It must have been belt-fed machine gun that fired during the testing, the military test. All right, so this wasn't like just testing in his shop back home, but made this absolutely beautiful piece of equipment that for the military, during that test, fired 20,000 rounds in 53 minutes and 17 seconds. The next closest contender took 98 minutes and 17 seconds. The competition spent almost half their time clearing jams and replacing broken parts, whereas Browning's design was only out of action for 46 seconds, which is absolutely impressive no matter what metric you're using. And the military wanted it bad. They're like, oh yeah, we want that. Now, up to this point, even through the war, Browning had basically led a pretty charmed life. He patented 128 different designs. He built up the family fortunes, traveled overseas multiple times. He did his patriotic duty rather than insisting on that royalty payment for each firearm. He took a flat sum for the government, and he was world famous, and he had a lot of prestige. And this all hit a brick wall from which the family really never recovered on April 9th, 1923. Browning's daughter, Elsie, had married one Benjamin Franklin Ballantyne about 10 years prior to that, so about 1913. And Ballantyne appeared to believe that because she was Browning's daughter, and he was now Browning's son-in-law, he was entitled to a cushy job with the Browning family with a cushy paycheck to match. And when none of this was forthcoming, because he had nothing really to offer the Brownings in return for this cushy job and cushy paycheck, he became resentful and belligerent, and was a drunk. He was an abusive drunk. He liked to spend money he didn't have, which necessitated Browning paying off Ballantyne's debts for him. And Ballantyne seemed to think that Browning owed him face-saving matter and should have just given him the money to pay the bills, and instead Browning just paid the debtor directly, which embarrassed Ballantyne. And on April 9th, this all came to a head when Elsie began divorce proceedings. Now, Browning's son, John, a.k.a. Jack, and Matt's son, Mariner, who was the close cousin with Elsie, went to the couple's house to help Elsie pack up not just herself, but Elsie and Ballantyne's 3 children, and leave, because divorce proceedings were finally started. But when Elsie actually got in the car to leave, Ballantyne became belligerent and demanded that she return to the house, which she did. Jack and Mariner went in with them at Elsie's request, and once inside, a drunk Ballantyne pulled out a gun. Mariner was quicker on the draw and shot him. Now, he died several hours later. He didn't die on the spot, but he died several hours later, and he made a dying declaration that he had not been armed and was just shot in cold blood. For some reason, and the author points this out, the dying declaration is a very old English law sentiment, that if you're on death's door, you have no reason to lie. Not even being a petty, belligerent, abusive, alcoholic drunk. gave you reason to lie, and so that was enough for the state of Utah to file murder charges against Mariner and Jack. Both were ultimately acquitted, but the stress was too great for Matt, who suffered a heart attack and died. And Matt had been Browning's lifelong partner and best friend. He was his younger brother. They had been together through thick and thin since Browning invented his first firearm at the age of 10. And he just never quite recovered from that. And he would die 3 years later on November 26, 1926, also of a heart attack. He was literally in the FN factory in Liège, Belgium, when he passed away. This book was outstanding. It was fast-paced. It reads like a novel. It pulled me right in and kept me reading. If you want to know more about the man behind the legend, I highly recommend The Guns of John Moses. Oh my God, I can't say Moses. Moses. If you want to know more about the man behind the legend, I highly recommend The Guns of John Moses Browning by Nathan Gorenstein. And that's it for this week. If you like what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys next Sunday. Bye.